There are known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. But there are also unknown knowns. We are the ancient and esoteric order of the Jackalope, a secret society devoted to unearthing and sharing this forgotten knowledge. Hey folks, number 13 here, coming to you from the secret recording bunker deep beneath our secret headquarters. Hoping everything's going okay up there. When the quarantine started, the Grand Jackalope just kind of shoved me down the hole and locked me down here, so I haven't heard any communications from the outside world in several weeks, so I'm hoping everything's okay. I'm doing fine. I got plenty of food and water and research material down here to keep me occupied. But they're kind of piping in this annoying birdsong noise, which, at first was a welcome distraction from the fact that I'm in a windowless room, but, after a while, you can just hear the repeats and it drives you nuts. So let's distract me from that and get on with today's episode, Pleadings from Asbury Park, presented by number 13. Laura Biggar always craved the spotlight. Even as a child, she never missed a chance to show off, whether it was stealing the show during the school play, showing off her singing skills in church, or just throwing herself into a game of charades. So no one was surprised when she left Delaware City at age 15 to join a touring theatrical company. Soon, Laura was a well-known ingenue performing in the touring company of Mr. W.A. Brady, appearing in shows like Fortune's Fool, Called Back, Snowflake, Heart and Hand, H. Rider Haggard's She, Hazel Kirk, An Irish Arab, and The Shatkin. It didn't hurt that Laura was a tall, statuesque blonde, something that never goes out of style. In 1886, she married fellow actor J.W. McConnell in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and gave birth to their only child, Willis, a year later. Alas, you can't be an ingenue forever. So as she entered her 20s, Laura turned to more daring and risque roles. In 1890, she made a splash in Dion Boucicault's After Dark as Eliza Medhurst, a woman driven to the verge of suicide, who is rescued at the last second by a mysterious hobo who turns out to be her own father. It's the sort of play where someone gets tied to railroad tracks, before that was ever a cliché. The production wasn't terribly well received because the play offended the morals of theater critics, but even they had to agree Laura's performance was a standout.
The best of the female impersonations is that of Eliza Medhurst by Laura Biggar, who speaks with the correctness and impressiveness and conveys to the character of the wronged and deserted wife a great deal of pathos. Her interpretation of two vocal solos in the last act is well done, though the propriety of it may be questioned.
Another person who wasn't a fan of the production was J.W. McConnell, mostly because his wife was canoodling with stage manager Stanislaus Strange. In Wisconsin, he caught Stan and Laura in bed together and flew into a jealous rage. He gave Strange a savage beating, quit the company, and not long after served Laura with divorce papers. That was fine by her. Laura was already on to her next triumph, an adaptation of Alexander Dumas's The Clemenceau Case. She starred as Isa Dobranowska, the beautiful daughter of a Russian countess whose lusts destroy her husband and her lover. It was an elaborate production, with 19 separate costume changes for Isa alone. But that's not what brought in the crowds. No, they were there for the scene where Isa seductively poses in the nude for sculptor Konstantin Ritz. To create the effect of nudity, Laura appeared on stage wearing nothing but flesh-colored tights. That's what packed the house, even as theater critics derided the show as immoral and lambasted Laura's performance as
petty, paltry, and unattractive a wanton as was ever made the axis of French dramatic nastiness.
Drunk on success, Laura made the first of many boneheaded moves. She quit the W.A. Brady Company in December to form her own management company. Needless to say, it didn't pan out, and she was reduced to taking smaller roles and performing in plays like Ali Baba, which were more burlesque than vaudeville. In 1892, she got a second chance when she was cast in a touring company of Charles R. Hoyt's smash hit musical, A Trip to Chinatown, as Mrs. Goyer, a Chicago widow on the lookout for a second chance. Crowds loved the chemistry she had with co-star and love interest Bert Haverly, ex-minstrel show performer. Apparently the chemistry was just as strong offstage. In 1893, Haverly became the second Mr. Laura Biggar. Buoyed by her comeback, Laura took more roles. She was Laura Skiddins, the Queen of Burlesque in Hoyt's A Black Sheep. She was the title character in Lawrence Marston's Lady Lil. And she was Lady Eastlake Chapel in Passing Show, where she had to share top billing with Barney Fagan and his Pickaninnies. None of those shows hit. Didn't matter. Audiences still loved her in A Trip to Chinatown. An enterprising Bert Haverly had acquired the rights to the show. Whenever Laura's current project would bomb, his company would stage a revival and let the money roll in. It was during her production of A Trip to Chinatown at Pittsburgh's Duquesne Theater when Laura Biggar first met Henry Martin Bennett. Henry M. Bennett hailed from a distinguished Vermont family. After graduating from college, he tried to make his fortune any way he could, joining the 1849 California Gold Rush, running a circus in the Midwest, opening a series of hotels in New York, and failed at each one. In 1869, it began to turn around for him. He opened a fur store on 6th Street in Pittsburgh, and soon he was making bank. He reinvested the profits into real estate and eventually expanded into bars, restaurants, and theaters. He eventually joined forces with 3 other theater owners in Brooklyn, Philadelphia, and Boston to form theatrical juggernaut R.M. Gulick and Company. He still found time to indulge his true passion, breeding horses at a farm in Monmouth County, New Jersey, just outside of Farmingdale. By April 1897, Bennett was one of the wealthiest and most famous men in Pittsburgh. He was also terribly lonely. His wife had died early in the year, he was in ill health, and the old farm was starting to feel awfully empty. Then, while sitting at his box at the Duquesne Theater, he saw Laura Biggar on stage, pouring her heart and soul into numbers like Out for a Racket. It stirred something inside of him. According to accounts, Bennett turned to his companion, chucked him on the shoulder, and declared, "I'm going to marry that girl." Bennett was 66. Biggar was 28. He invited Laura out to dinner. Of course she said yes. What actress would pass up a chance to get FaceTime with an impresario of Bennett's stature? Dinner turned into drinks and maybe something more. He started following the production as it moved from town to town, lavishly entertaining its lovely star after every show. It's easy to see what Henry Bennett liked about Laura Biggar. She was young, vivacious, and voluptuous. It's also easy to see what Biggar liked about Bennett. He was rich, charming, and co-owned a chain of theaters. Poor Bert Haverly didn't like it at all, but what could he do? Tell his wife not to sleep with the man who could make or break both of their careers? He bit his tongue, pretended to believe his wife's claims that Bennett was a harmless old man, and thanked his lucky stars that it wasn't worse. Then it got worse. In January 1898, Laura refused to perform in Wilmington, Delaware until she was repaid some $170 that she had loaned the company to get the show off the ground. Management hemmed and hawed, but ultimately promised her that if she took the stage, they would have the money for her after the show. Then Haverly spoke up, asking to be repaid the money he had fronted for the show. That put management in a bind. They could repay husband or wife, but not both. They made the only sensible decision. Haverly owned the rights to the show, so without him there was no show. They let Haverly take the stage and sent out Laura's understudy. Laura quit and fled to New York, where she took up residence in a Manhattan apartment owned by Bennett. Haverly sued the impresario for alienation of affection, seeking damages of $10,000. The 2 parties eventually settled out of court, and Haverly and Biggar divorced. With her ex-husband out of the way, Henry Bennett turned his attention to promoting Laura Biggar's career. He landed her 2 plum roles almost immediately, in the daring The Queen of Chinatown and in the naval farce The White Squadron. Both shows closed quickly after poor reviews, which singled Laura out for extra criticism. She did not take it well. In August 1898, Laura was rescued from the surf in Asbury Park. She was unconscious, and it took several hours for her to come round. The press spun it as a swimming accident, but truth be told, it sounds like a suicide attempt. With no career and no husband, Biggar turned her attention to the one thing she did have, Henry M. Bennett. I mean, technically she also had her son Willis, but Laura Biggar was not exactly Mother of the Year material. Willis had a tendency to wander off whenever he felt like it, and Laura doesn't seem to have cared. Henry M. Bennett was not a well man. He was suffering from blood poisoning, which ultimately led to the amputation of his leg in April 1901. After the operation, he needed round-the-clock supervision, regular doses of medicine, and mental stimulation to prevent him from becoming demented. One person was ideally suited for all those roles, Laura Biggar. As the Chicago Tribune put it,
her audience consisted of one bedridden, querulous old man, and she had to spend all day long and every day in seemingly futile efforts to entertain him and keep him from sinking into hopeless melancholia.
Essentially, she'd become the Anna Nicole Smith of 1901. It was not quite the career she'd dreamed of as a girl. Henry M. Bennett died on April 9, 1902, from blood poisoning and the lingering complications of his amputation the previous year. Laura Biggar was the chief mourner at his funeral. Dressed in heavy black mourning clothes, she accompanied his casket on the long ride from Farmingdale to Asbury Park, weeping the whole way. She looked thin and tired, and upon returning to the farmhouse, she fainted on the threshold. R.M. Gulick claimed her constant vigil over his late business partner had left her at the verge of nervous exhaustion. She apparently felt a lot better a few weeks later when the will was read. She showed up again in mourning attire, but her full cheeks were rosy and her large blue eyes were bright. Bennett's will left the farm to his brother-in-law, Ira Shattuck, with the exception of a few items that went to longtime employees. His former secretary, Peter J. McNulty, received some property and a gold watch. And Laura Biggar received a cool $1,000 in cash to be paid within 10 days of probate, an annuity worth $1,800 a year, which would be inherited by her son Willis upon her death. All the furs, jewels, and art owned by the late Mrs. Bennet, estimated to be worth $300,000. A house at 119 East 83rd Street in Manhattan, estimated to be worth $40,000, and some property that had been mortgaged, estimated to be worth $200,000 once the mortgage was paid off. Bennett's business interests and investments would continue under the management of R.M. Gulick and Company for 5 years, at the end of which they would be sold off and the profit split 60-40 between Biggar and McNulty. Those interests were estimated by the papers to be worth approximately $2 million. Laura Biggar was going to be a very wealthy woman. Well, assuming the will stood up in court. Bennett's niece and nephew were not satisfied with the paltry $5,000 payouts they were to receive. They noted that the current will, filed in January, had been drafted during their uncle's recovery, during a period where he could best be described as feeble-minded and childish. They claimed that Biggar had exerted undue influence over the ailing magnate and demanded that the courts recognize the will Bennett had filed the previous April, before his amputation, when he was of sound mind. It was a gamble. Under the terms of the will, any beneficiary who tried to contest the will would forfeit their inheritance if they failed. But the Bennets were all in and hired a small army of lawyers and detectives to prove their point. Biggar took her case to the papers, playing the wronged woman. She claimed that in Bennett's last days he was as helpless as a newborn child. He became paranoid, wouldn't take food or medicine prepared by anyone else, and had to be spoon-fed. He suffered from insomnia and forced Biggar to stay up with him reading or singing. She played the part to the hilt, making the regular frustrations of caregiving sound like emotional abuse at the hand of a demanding tyrant. It was effective, but she also couldn't resist making a few statements that seemed a bit, let's say, staged.
I shall never marry again. I married when I was so young that my first long dress was my wedding gown. I made my debut on the stage when I was but a child. I shall never return to the theatrical profession. The stock farm, my son, the horses and the dogs are my little world now. The horses seem to know my voice and come to me when I call them, and I have my own pet horse, named Laura B. in honor of me. I am now getting the first real glimpse of sunshine I've had for 4 long years. It's too bad that unfeeling people envy me this.
When the Bennett suit went to court in early July, Laura Biggar was nowhere to be found. In her place stood Dr. Charles C. Hendrick. Hendrick was a handsome graduate of Seton Hall who ran a sanitarium for the rich at Bergen Point near Bayonne. In between patients, he read the law and also became a successful lawyer. He'd been elected to the County Board of Health, but any further political aspirations he'd had were shot in the foot when he declared that it was good that President McKinley had been shot and that he should have been shot long before. Dr. Hendrick explained that the strain of the preceding weeks had been too much for Miss Biggar, and she'd retired to his sanitarium. She would be unavailable for the next several weeks. In the meantime, he was her representative. The session was inconclusive. Some of Bennett's employees testified that he was not of sound mind when the will was drafted, but others testified that he had moments of lucidity and that the will accurately reflected his desires. Sensing that maybe their case wasn't as strong as it seemed, the Bennets tried to reach a settlement with the executors of the will, but Hendrick squashed that. Then, 2 bombshells landed. On August 13, a casket was delivered to the cemetery where Bennett was buried. Accompanying the casket was a note.
Will you please have an opening made in the plot of Henry M. Bennett for the burial of this child? Signed, Laura Biggar.
There was a small silver nameplate on the casket. Henry M. Bennett, Jr. died August 15th, aged 15 days. Hendrick also produced affidavits from Laura attesting that she and Bennett had been clandestinely married. The affidavits were rather pointedly signed by Laura Biggar Bennett. This was a game changer. If Bennett and Biggar had indeed been married and had a child, the will would be null and void because it made no allowance for him. That would cut Biggar out of the will entirely because all the property would go to the child. But since the child was dead, the rights would revert to his surviving parent. Hendrick and Biggar were making a play for all the marbles. But when those claims were examined in court in September, they started to seem awfully suspicious. Former Justice of the Peace Samuel Stanton testified that he'd been roused from the bed in the middle of the night to marry the couple on January 2nd, 1898. He'd filled out a marriage certificate, but instead of just taking it into work the next day, he dropped it in the mail and it was lost in the post. He produced a copy he had made, which was entered into the court record over the strenuous objections of the executors. It was signed by a witness, another tenant in his apartment building, who had since died. The timing of the midnight marriage was strange, since in early January 1898, Laura had been away from New Jersey performing in a night in Chinatown. Plus, she was still married to Bert Haverly at the time. Her affidavits also testified that the couple had a second marriage ceremony in Europe in the early part of 1901, before the amputation of Bennett's leg. But the timing didn't work out there either. Bennett had been so ill at that point that he'd had to cancel a trip to Canada. There was no way he would have been well enough to take a sea voyage. Dr. John T. Connolly testified that he had gone to the Bergen Point Sanitarium in July to deliver a baby. He tentatively identified the mother as Mrs. Bennett, but could not be sure. The baby was premature and sickly, and died shortly thereafter under his care. But Connolly also testified he kept no records of his visits to the sanitarium, and had never billed anyone for his services, which sounds very unlike a doctor. Hendricks seemed to realize that his gamble was not paying off. On September 26th, he made a motion to withdraw Biggar's claim and restore the original terms of the will. It was still a risky move. Remember, under the terms of the will, anyone contesting it was disinherited. But we'll never know whether the motion would have been granted. As Hendrick made his motion, 2 deputy sheriffs burst into the courtroom waving warrants and arrested Hendrick and Stanton for conspiracy to defraud. They were thrown in jail and detained under $5,000 bail. 2 more deputies were sent to Bergen Point to arrest Biggar, but found her room empty and in a state of disarray. She'd fled to Manhattan and was seeking refuge among her friends in the theater community. She found a new lawyer, the amazingly named Samuel I. Frankenstein, who she used to feed her side of the story to the press. Biggar once again cast Bennett as an egomaniacal monster who mistreated her in an attempt to make herself seem sympathetic. She claimed there was a conspiracy to disinherit her, led by Peter J. McNulty, who had hypnotized Bennett during the drafting of his will. She pled poverty, claiming the legal proceedings had left her virtually penniless, since any money she was entitled to under the will were held up until it went to probate. She said she would abandon her claims if the original bequest would be allowed to stand. When Frankenstein was asked how that would work with the poison pill clause in the will, he claimed she was not contesting it in the capacity of the Laura Biggar named in the will, but in that of the widow of Henry M. Bennett and the mother of his child. That's some mighty lawyerly hair-splitting right there. Laura also claimed to be entirely innocent of conspiracy, but was unwilling to spend any time in jail.
I do not care to surrender myself until I am sure of being able to furnish bail. However, I have no intention of running away.
Fortunately for her, someone did step up to offer bail. Two-bid vaudeville agent Freeman Bernstein. Bernstein figured that after it was all over, he could put Biggar back on stage and make a mint whether she was guilty or innocent. Of course, Bernstein didn't have $5,000 to post bail for Biggar, but one of his clients did, the former heavyweight boxing champion of the world, James J. Corbett. Gentleman Jim had been a friend of Laura's from her vaudeville days when they were both under the management of W.A. Brady. But even with her bail guaranteed, Laura was in no hurry to turn herself in. Frustrated by the delay, Bernstein and Corbett revoked their offer. Laura remained in hiding for an entire month, only turning herself in at the beginning of November as the authorities started to close in. Turns out she'd been hiding in plain sight at 119 East 83rd Street, one of the properties she was supposed to receive according to the will. She claimed that she'd been hoping to raise the $20,000 bail necessary to secure her own freedom as well as that of her co-conspirators, claiming that they would all hang together. Then friends managed to raise her individual $5,000 bail, and she waltzed to freedom, leaving Hendrick and Stanton to rot in jail. The case was set to go to trial on December 16th. To raise funds and fill time, Biggar returned to vaudeville, appearing in a sketch rather distastefully titled, A Strange Baby. She had shows scheduled right up to the start of the trial. When the trial started on December 16th, Laura tried to plead as Laura Bennett, but the judge denied her. She, Hendrick, and Stanton all pled not guilty. The prosecution made a pretty damning case and laid out the plot in detail. In April, Dr. Hendrick had read notices about Henry Bennett's death and Laura Biggar's inheritance in the papers. Those accounts also mentioned her poor health and fragile emotional state, and he saw an opportunity. He wrote Biggar several letters offering to come out to the farm, take care of her health, and represent her interests in court. She ultimately relented, and when he finally made it to the farm, she was instantly taken with the handsome young doctor/lawyer, and he with his pulchritutinous patient. She moved into the Bergen Point Sanitarium, and the two began a passionate affair, even though Hendrick was already married with one child and his wife was several months pregnant. The affair offended Hendrick's brother James, an assistant at the sanitarium, who had him arrested in June and charged with immoral conduct. The charges were eventually dismissed. During the initial court proceedings, Biggar made an offhand comment that if she was not provided for, she'd sue for a share of the estate as Bennett's common-law wife. The idea was meritless. The two hadn't been together nearly long enough for her to qualify, and for part of that time she'd been legally married to someone else. But it gave Hendrick an idea. On July 2nd, the conspiracy was hatched in a Long Branch hotel room over room service, cigars, and 21 absinthe frappés. They would claim the whole estate by creating fraudulent evidence of the marriage and producing a fake heir. Hendrick found Samuel Stanton, a retired justice of the peace who still had some blank marriage certificates lying around, and slipped him a bribe of $10,000 to backdate one for Biggar and Bennett. Then he procured a dead baby, most likely the stillborn child of another patient at the sanitarium, though some accounts ghoulishly suggest it might have been Hendrick's own stillborn child, and sent that baby to the cemetery to establish the existence of an heir. There was only one problem. It was a really bad plan. There were so many holes in the story that it would never add up, and by dragging Stanton into the plot, they'd guaranteed its failure. Stanton wasn't the first potential co-conspirator Hendrick had approached. He was the third. The authorities knew someone was trying to bribe a justice of the peace, so when the previously broke Stanton suddenly came into money, he was immediately suspect. When Stanton then tried to bribe one of his former associates to slip the fake marriage certificate into the archive, the offended clerk went straight to the police, and they knew they had their man. It wasn't even a good fake marriage certificate. It had been used for someone else and then scraped clean. The witness who co-signed turned out to not even exist. And most damningly, the form had the first 2 digits of the year pre-filled, 19 blank blank. The marriage was supposed to have taken place in 1898. Oh. The prosecution had other damning evidence. Friends of Bennett's, who testified that he never had any intention to remarry. Scandalous love letters written from Hendrick to Biggar. Correspondence written by Biggar after her marriage where she failed to use her married name. I mean, that's a bit sexist, and it's not like Laura hadn't kept using her maiden name after her previous 2 marriages anyway. They also had testimony that Biggar had been having affairs with other actors during the period where she was supposed to have been married. The defense was surprisingly weak, consisting largely of outright denials backed up by hearsay from Biggar's actor friends, casual acquaintances, and former employees, all of whom assumed that Biggar and Bennett were married because of how they carried on. For her part, Biggar seemed to hinge her defense on a poor harried woman act, aided by sorrowful sighs and melodramatic swoons at appropriate points during the trial. On December 24th, the jury took only a few hours to reach a verdict. Guilty. Wait, let me amend that. Dr. Hendrick and Stanton were found guilty and sentenced to 3 years in jail. Laura Biggar was found not guilty of all charges. Apparently, one juror was swayed by Biggar's cheap theatrics and was convinced that she was an innocent dupe who had been led into trouble by Hendrick. He could not be swayed. Rather than return a hung jury or be stuck in the courthouse deliberating over Christmas, the other jurors agreed on a compromise. Acquit Biggar, convict her accomplices. It was completely nonsensical, but what could you do? She'd successfully used the sexist assumptions of the day to walk away scot-free. While Hendrick and Stanton languished behind bars, Biggar went back on the road with a new sketch, A Thief in the Night. She promised she would raise bail for Hendrick while he appealed, but did not. Eventually, Hendrick's mother had to raise the bail, and he repaid her by leaving home to join Biggar as a scene partner on the vaudeville circuit. In November 1903, the New Jersey Supreme Court found that improper evidence had been admitted during the trial, and that there were problems with the jury instructions to boot. They ordered a retrial, which never happened. Hendrick and Stanton were free men. Well, Hendrick was. Stanton later got into a drunken brawl with a 7-year-old girl and was thrown back into jail. Amazingly, the not guilty verdict meant that Laura was still eligible to inherit from the Bennett estate. Unfortunately, that estate was worth far less than the original $2 million estimate. It turns out the hospitality industry is a fickle beast and stocks can go up as well as down. Who knew? But Laura would not accept that fact and spent more than a decade locked in a protracted legal battle with the executors while her personal debts mounted. She couldn't even pay her lawyers. She owed Samuel I. Frankenstein some $23,000 in legal fees, which he had to have garnished from her wages. Amazingly, in 1906, she was provisionally awarded some $400,000 by the courts, only to be immediately countersued for $300,000 by Dr. Hendrick. He claimed he was owed for services rendered, legal and otherwise. In his court filings, he made some familiar arguments, claiming Biggar was an emotional vampire who required his constant attention, leaving him in a fragile emotional state. By 1916, the estate was finally settled. Alas, Laura had Jarndyce v. Jarndyce the whole thing, frittering away most of the money she could have inherited on legal and administrative costs. In the end, she received some property and her annuity and not much else. But Laura's legal problems didn't end there. In 1903, Dr. Hendrick petitioned the court for a divorce from his wife Agnes, claiming she had been unfaithful. Mrs. Hendrick, understandably offended, filed for divorce on the same grounds. She had months' worth of newspaper clippings to back up her claims. To top it off, she sued Laura Biggar for alienating her husband's affections, seeking $150,000 in damages. In the middle of these bitter divorce proceedings, tragedy struck when the Hendricks son was mysteriously kidnapped, herded by strangers into an unmarked cab. It soon turned out he had been kidnapped by Dr. Hendrick, who whisked him away to a Vermont farm that Biggar had inherited from Bennett. When they were found out, Hendrick and Biggar dumped the boy in a Boston orphanage and fled to Montreal. He was eventually recovered by the police and sent back to his mother. With shenanigans like that, Hendrick and Biggar were not exactly sympathetic defendants. The courts found for Mrs. Hendrick, awarding her $75,000. At the time, it was the largest ever award for alienation of affection. Biggar, of course, could not pay, even when the award was cut down to $50,000 by the judge, and even further to $30,000 on appeal. She was once again forced back onto the stage until she could pay off the judgment. Biggar and Hendrick were together for years, but did not marry until 1916 after the estate was finally settled. Hendrick died 2 years later of a heart attack while scouting out property to build a new sanitarium. Laura lived on for another 16 years, passing in 1935. Laura Biggar wasn't a very good criminal. Her plans were petty, poorly thought out, and badly implemented. Her schemes even wound up costing her money. Gulick and the other executors would have gladly paid her off just to get her out of their hair. In the end, she only escaped justice because of her acting abilities and because the casual sexism of the day meant one fool didn't think she had the capacity to be a monster. At least in the process, she gave us a rollicking story filled with sham marriages, dead babies, cheap theatrics, a drunken brawl with a 7-year-old girl, fake kidnappings, and ridiculous schemes cooked up over 21 absinthe frappes. Alright, first let me apologize. I know the Monmouth County Courthouse is actually in Freehold, but I couldn't resist the title. Connections! Freeman Bernstein, who offered to pay Laura Biggar's bill, was also the agent who booked spiritualist scam artist Anne Odelia Distabar at Oscar Hammerstein's Victoria Theatre in 1909, and he lost his shirt in the process there too. We covered Distabar's notorious career in Series 3, Spirit Princess. Most of our sources for this episode came from the contemporary newspapers at the time, but I'd like to give a shout out to Walter Shapiro's biography of Freeman Bernstein, Hustling Hitler, where I first encountered this strange story. It's a fun book filled with amusing tales of small-time cons and penny ante thievery. Check it out. This episode was produced by David White for the Ancient and Esoteric Order of the Jackalope podcast and is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 International License. All rights reserved, all wrongs reversed. The script of this episode, along with sources, links, and more, can be found on our website at orderofthejackalope.com. That's Order of the Jackalope with hyphens. You can keep up with our research, release schedule, and more on our social media accounts. We can be found at Order Jackalope on Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, and Reddit. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends, or your enemies, or even total strangers. We're not picky. Hey you! Want to join the fastest growing secret society in the nation? Of course you do. But before you can be initiated into the hidden secrets, you gotta share a hidden secret of your own. Visit our website at orderofthejackalope.com for more information. Oh, if I ever write a phrase like all of whom assumed again, please shoot me. Oh God, 12 takes.